Hi everybody and welcome back to our discussion on Chapter 17, which is going to talk about children and adolescents participating in sports, exercise, and physical activity. So when you're working with children, there's three main things I want you to consider. Children can participate in exercise and physical activity just like adults can. However, we need to be careful about three distinct processes that are going on in children and adolescents when they participate. And that is because children and adolescents are going through this constant process of growth, development, and maturation. So growth is when we are physically increasing the size of a body or a body part. So we are actually increasing the number of cells that are participating in a certain activity. Development, on the other hand, is going to be the differentiation or some sort of functional change that is going to occur that allows a body part or body system to work more efficiently. So for example, if we're talking about fetal development, the lungs are functional and made somewhere near the end of the second trimester. However, they do not become functional components until surfactant is being produced by the lungs. Surfactant is what allows the alveoli to remain open. So there has been a developmental change in the structure of those lung cells. And then the final process is maturation. So this is when we have taken a particular system or body part, it's gone through growth and development, and it is now matured to the adult form. Oftentimes we spend a lot of time here talking about differences between chronological age and skeletal age. Also, another big component working with children is going to be when a child reaches sexual maturation. So this is when for females, this will be the onset of menarche or the first period. And for males, it's a lot harder to determine. We typically look at secondary sex characteristics, development of facial hair, deepening of the voice, and the ability to reproduce. So these three processes are going to impact everything that a child is able to do when they participate in physical activity. There's also going to be four distinct phases of development of a child that we are considering. The first is going to be infancy. This is the first year of life. And there's going to be a lot of growth and development occurring during this time period. Typically, as exercise professionals, we're not working during the span of infancy unless there is some sort of physical therapy or occupational therapy going on. As we go into childhood, this is going to be from the first birthday on to the onset of puberty. Childhood lasts for varying periods of time, depending on when puberty is going to start for the child. So for females, typically puberty starts somewhere between the ages of 11 and 13, but it can also start much earlier, much later. And for boys, it tends to be somewhere between the ages of 11 and 14. Again, can be, or 12 and 14, I apologize. Again, a little bit later than the girls, but a lot more difficult to determine because there is not that one defining characteristic for puberty like females. It is menarche. For boys, it's more the development of those secondary sex characteristics. Puberty itself is going to be a long period of time, lasts somewhere between a year to 2 and 3 years, depending on how quickly a child goes through puberty. This is when you're going to have the development of all of your secondary sex characteristics. So females, the development of breasts and body hair. Gentlemen, it will be body hair and facial hair, and deepening of the voice. And then finally, adolescence is where we go from puberty until we reach full adult form, which for females is somewhere between the ages of 16 and 20, and for boys is somewhere between the ages of 18 to 22 to 24. All right, so a couple different things we want to consider with how children develop. And we're looking strictly at height and weight initially. There's going to be kind of this interchange where we rapidly develop height and weight. So between birth and 2 years of age, there's going to be very large changes in birth from birth to 2 in weight and height. Then that will slow down a little bit more between the ages of 2 and just before puberty, so between the ages of 10 and 13. It'll be nice, slow, steady growth. Then we're going to hit puberty, and we're going to have a very fast change with height and weight again. And then we'll go from about the middle of puberty into the late teens to adulthood, where again, it'll be slow, gradual change. Also, height and weight changes are not synchronized. So even though we see big changes in these time periods, it doesn't mean these big changes are happening at the same time. So height is going to change usually first, and then weight will catch up afterwards. So you can kind of think of with puberty, kids get really tall and skinny, and then they kind of fill out, and then they get tall and skinny again, and then they kind of fill out. So we'll see the peak changes in height around 12 years old for girls and around 14 for boys. And then the weight will catch up about half a year later. We'll see our largest weight changes around 12.5 for girls and around 14.5 for boys. All right, the next thing we're concerned about is bone development of children. There is kind of this terrible rumor out there that children shouldn't participate in vigorous levels of physical activity because it's going to damage their growth plates. Well, that's just simply not true. If you take the appropriate precautions in working with children, you're not going to damage their growth plates or their bone development at all. Basically, what is happening is your bones are going to be constantly ossifying or strengthening and hardening from when you're a fetus all the way up to adulthood. The biggest changes are going to happen at the growth plate. So these are areas of cartilage within our long bones where we're actually going to see the length changes in the bone. Once that growth plate closes or ossifies, that bone is done growing. So it's really dangerous if children break a bone and it crosses that growth plate, because we're now going to have issues with growth plate changes, but still be participating in vigorous physical activity or weightlifting is not going to damage that growth plate. What is going to kind of stimulate the closure of this growth plate is the presence of estrogen. So estrogen obviously is going to be increased in production in females when they hit puberty. So their growth plates are going to close somewhere in the mid-teens. And then boys, because testosterone is the major player that shows up during puberty, they're going to have much lower estrogen levels, so their growth plates close later, usually somewhere in the later teens to early 20s. So this is why women stop growing sooner than boys in terms of height. Also, you need to make sure that you have adequate calcium intake during childhood to ensure you have proper bone ossification. So we think about calcium coming from things like dairy products, but you can also get it from vegetables and beans, which can be very high in calcium, or you can take calcium supplements. But basically, you want to make sure calcium intake is adequate early in life so you can prevent osteoporosis and other bone diseases later in life. All right, next, we know muscle mass is also going to increase with children, and it tends to have a nice steady increase as they gain weight, as they grow. So initially, muscle mass is about 25% of your weight when you were born. And then it will grow to around 30 to 35% of the body weight in women, and about 40 to 45% of the body weight in men. And again, that is due to the presence of estrogen in females and testosterone in males. This peak in muscle mass for girls is going to be somewhere between 16 and 20, and for boys will be somewhere between 18 and 25. Typically, we're going to see muscle fiber hypertrophy be the reasons for the increases in muscle mass. And our longer sarcomeres, or the production of more sarcomeres, is going to be what allows us to increase our muscle length. Fat, on the other hand, we don't really have a nice trend for. Basically, what's going to determine the amount of fat between children and their adult counterparts is going to be factors that affect the amount of body fat that we put down. So our amount of exercise, our nutrition, and our genetics. So we can't change our genetics. Some individuals are more prone to putting on more body fat than others. So for example, if you can think of individuals of Northern European descent, so Viking heritage, Scandinavia, Denmark, these kind of places, it's really cold there. It makes sense genetically for those individuals to have higher amounts of body fat because it keeps them warm. So you pull them out of that particular area, and these trends still stay. So you have this genetic component, but also if you have excess energy resources that you are consuming, so you're overeating calorie-wise, or you're incredibly sedentary, this is going to impact body fat more than growth change or maturation. Also neurologically, children are very different than adults. So children have to go through the process of myelination. So their nerves become wrapped in the myelin sheath, which is going to allow for better nerve conduction and signal conduction. So our brain and our spinal cord can tell our muscles and other parts of our body what to do more efficiently. So as this myelination occurs in childhood, children are going to develop better balance, agility, and coordination. And this is going to continue into the early to mid-20s when full myelination takes place. Additionally, you're going to see changes in strength, cardiovascular and respiratory function, and metabolic function in children, despite the fact that they may or may not be participating in physical activity. So, children tend to get stronger as they increase in their muscle mass as they age. We tend to have peak strength for women at around 20 years old and peak strength for men between 20 and 30. This increase in strength typically is a couple different things going on. The first is the myelination of the nervous system. So we're more coordinated in our muscle contraction movements, but also the presence of sex hormones, testosterone specifically, after puberty is going to allow for better improvements in strength. And after puberty, these strength increases tend to be more linear, whereas puberty, this tends to be more exponential in changes. Also, we know that children are going to have higher resting heart rates and higher maximal heart rates than adults. So their hearts beat faster, but since they are immature, they are going to have lower stroke volumes, which means overall, even though their heart rate is higher, their stroke volume is lower. That means their cardiac output's also going to be lower, which means they don't deliver oxygen to the working muscles and other parts of the body as efficiently. This means that there's going to be a larger AVO2 difference, and the body is going to have to compensate for it. Looking forward, we also know that lung functioning is not as efficient in children as it is in adults. Lung volume will increase with age. As the body size increases, the rib cage has more area to expand, and the body can bring in more oxygen. Also, metabolic function. As children age, their metabolism and their ability to break down nutrients is going to become more efficient. So when we look at the differences between children and adults, metabolically they can take in similar amounts of food and fuel, but they're not going to use it as efficiently as children as they would compared to adults. This is going to impact the ability to put on muscle mass, have maximum strength, and your cardiorespiratory functioning. So, looking at this, since we have these big changes in our differences between the cardiovascular functionality in terms of the heart development, the lung development, the ability for the muscles to put on muscle mass, there's going to be some differences with cardiorespiratory training and strength training between children and adults. Basically, what you're going to see here is you can't train children like little mini adults. You have to compensate for the differences here. Another thing that children are going to struggle with is exercise economy. So because they are not, their nerves are not fully myelinated, they're going to struggle to produce the same efficiency of movements, which means it's going to take more energy for a child to do the same workload that it would for an adult. So we know that a child's oxygen consumption per kilogram, so their VO2 is going to be greater than an adult's. Basically, as a child ages, their skills will improve, their strides will lengthen, they'll become more efficient at the movements, and their cost of activity is going to decrease. This means just naturally through development, their endurance is going to get better as they go from child to adult. Children also have lower glycolytic capacity in muscles. Children are anaerobic creatures in nature. You don't typically see a 6-year-old say, I'm going to go for a 2-mile run. If you've ever observed recess working with children, They tend to sprint somewhere, and then they sit down and they talk for a second, and then they go climb on the monkey bars and sprint around one more time, and then they sit and play in the sandbox, and then they take off over here, and then they stop and they take off over there. Children are anaerobic in nature. Big bursts of energy, quick recoveries, more rest time, and they're off to do it again. So this means that their ATP PCR system is going to work very similarly to adults, but in terms of glycolysis and aerobic respiration, they're going to be far less efficient than adults. Also, children don't have the same endocrine responses as adults. So like testosterone still activates the same things, and human growth hormone still activates the same things, but their systems are not very efficient. They don't produce adequate amounts of our hormones to get these big responses that we would expect in adults. So this means that children are going to have a much larger stress response than adults to exercise, and it's going to tire them out a lot more than adults. Children are also going to kind of burn through substrates much faster than adults because remember, those metabolic systems are not mature and not working very efficiently. So this means when we go to train children, we need to be very conscious of how we do it. So body weight and body composition changes, they'll have similar responses, but I have to be very careful with how I train them so that I'm eliciting appropriate responses. So as we come up here, looking at kind of some taboos, children can strength train, as I've mentioned before. In fact, I highly encourage children to strength train, and it's very beneficial. But you have to be careful with how you prescribe and supervise it. Children are not always mature emotionally mature enough to be in a weight room. So this is going to cause delays with what they can handle, what they can do. This means that children need to be very highly supervised, and we're going to hope that they treat their weight room with respect and don't want to play around constantly. Also, children actually have a relatively low injury risk, assuming that they're doing motions well. We know that strength gains in children are only going to be neural, much less hypertrophy-based, because they don't have the testosterone to make that happen. And most of that is going to change once they hit adolescence. Also, we know aerobic training with children, we're not going to see these big changes in VO2 max because, again, their metabolic systems are not mature yet. But we will see increases in performance, and this is because their running economy improves and their neural engagement is going to improve. So basically, children are anaerobic in nature, but we can train them to be aerobic. As their system matures, they will handle things much better. Also, we need to be considerate on making sure that children are participating in physical activity that they find fun and engaging. Children should be participating in about 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity a day, whereas we know the adult recommendation is 150 minutes a week of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So we need to get kids moving, and oftentimes we do that through participation in sport and physical activity. However, when we start looking at sports, we tend to specialize children far too early. So if you think about when you were younger, what sports did you participate in? Did you participate in any? So for example, when I was a kid, I did softball, basketball, track, powerlifting. I rode my bike everywhere. I knew how to rollerblade. Unfortunately, my mother wouldn't let me skateboard. But I was a very active child. It wasn't until I was almost 16 that I specialized into the sport of track and field. When we ask our children to specialize far too early, we increase their injury risks for overuse injuries. So make sure that we don't specialize our kids too early, because then also, if we specialize too early, children tend to burn out. They become exhausted with the sport, and it actually will impact their ability to participate in lifelong physical activity, which is what we know is the healthiest for our kids. So I hope you found this informative. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and I look forward to seeing you guys back for Chapter 18. Bye.